once gender determinations are made, then a whole house of cards of other determinations, or dominoes rather, sort of fall into place. When men are in that position, that moment is not sexualized in the same way. Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio, the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Chief Engineer Ebony Adams, and I'm joined today by a member of my crew who keeps asking whether she's eligible for a full share of the bonuses, Carolyn Pettit. Hey, Carol.
Hey, I just don't feel good about this bonus situation, Ebony. I'm just not feeling good about the bonus situation.
Well, I'll tell you what, you're right not to feel good about it, because we are all getting played on this ship. In this week's episode, we are going to be talking about the seminal sci-fi horror film Alien, which celebrates its 40th anniversary this year. Directed by Ridley Scott and starring Sigourney Weaver, Tom Skerritt, John Hurt, Yaphet Kotto, Ian Holm, Harry Dean Stanton, and Veronica Cartwright. So basically like a rogues gallery of the best character actors of the past 50 years. This is so great, right? The film is a slow-building tour de force of what befalls the crew of the commercial spaceship Nostromo when they awaken from hypersleep to investigate a mysterious alien transmission from deep space. What they find, and what they must then battle to stay alive, is a horrifying primal monster of absolute malice and acid for blood. Stay tuned for our discussion. All right, Caro.
Yo.
I want to just get into this. I want to start by telling folks that, first of all, my parents, their first date was to go see the movie Alien.
Oh, interesting.
And then, as many FemFreak supporters know, I have written and talked about the movie Aliens ad nauseum. This series, this franchise is just real important for me and for my family, and I'm not sure why we imprinted on it quite so deeply, but we did. And in fact, I'm going to try and get my dad on the phone tomorrow to record a little bonus, because one of the things that frustrates me a little bit about my enjoyment of the film, which is, just on 100,000. Like, I could watch this movie 4 times a week, which is probably excessive. I admit that. But anyways, the fact that I could not see this film when it came out, right? So what must it have been like in 1979 to see this movie? I don't know how mind-bending it must have been. Just on almost every level.
Exactly. Like, that's the thing about it is when because I just rewatched the film for the purposes of this podcast too, and I'm fascinated by all the different layers of this film. Because, first of all, you've got, the very working class aspect. Mm-hmm. Like, these aren't, this would kind of obviously shift in Aliens. You have the Marines, and Aliens is very much an action film in a lot of ways. These are just working people. Like they're literally they're working people in space. You don't really, big budget mainstream films, don't often give working people, I think, the level of kind of just basic respect and attention that this film does. And then, how do you even begin peeling back the layers of the horror of H.R. Giger's Alien itself, and all the things that it represents? Because what makes Giger's artwork so unsettling? Well, in basic terms, to me, it has something to do with the combination of the mechanical and the biological, and somehow, I think on some level, it provokes thoughts, at least for me, of our own bodies, my own body, and the ways in which our own bodies could be viewed as a kind of machine, or the ways in which we can be viewed as a kind of machine. And to me, that kind of then comes back around to the ways in which, to the capitalist critique at the center of this film, and the ways in which the company clearly only views the crew as expendable machines. Right. We get that reveal toward the end of, what is the secret directive? What is Ash's mission? All other priorities rescinded. Recover the the specimen, crew expendable.
Right. I mean, and we get that line earlier from Dallas when they're first heading down to what we later learn will be called LV-426, when the shuttle drops away from the main body of the craft and he says, like, the money is safe, meaning the cargo, not the crew, but the money, the cargo is safe.
But there's another level too, on which this film is just so enjoyable and so fascinating to me, and that is like the just the basic filmmaking, in the sense of like, there's so much that about this film that to me feels like something that we've sort of almost lost from the filmmaking of the 70s, and maybe even just uniquely like something that Ridley Scott was really leaning into here. Like you have these great scenes of camaraderie with the crew and of like overlapping dialogue and things, and it just like, I feel in those early scenes where you're just like observing the crew, I feel this this kind of realism to and the realism is reinforced by the fact that the environments that the whole film basically takes place in, to me they look believable as functional spaces. They don't, I believe that this is a commercial ship that is just designed as a place for people to do work to profit a company. It doesn't look like, some movie set that's designed to look cool. It looks like just a place where people are going to live and work. And, but gosh, like watching the early scenes in this film, where you get, because again, like, what a phenomenal cast. I mean, I love Yaphet Kotto so much, and like Harry Dean Stanton and all these people. And it's like, gosh, and Tom Skerritt is so good. It's so like kind of comfortable in his skin as Dallas, that just kind of laid back, leadership quality. And I just like, I almost wish that we got a whole film with this crew where like everything goes okay, like just so we can like just so we can spend more time with them as just like hanging out with them, because like so there's just like so many layers on which this film is pleasurable. It's beautifully, like, I mean, I even tweeted a few times today about just like shot composition and stuff in this movie that's just gorgeous. And then of course, not to even mention all the like, just wonderfully complex and layers of kind of horror on which the film operates as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I kind of facetiously, when I was putting together the outline of the notes for today's script, I kind of facetiously noted that this is, at its core, a workplace drama, which it's super into. But I am being facetious, but I'm also being partially serious because, as you say, like, we very quickly become invested in, kind of the interpersonal dynamics of this small crew. It's only 7 people in this crew, right? And, you could make the case that this movie demonstrates what happens when women in the workplace are not listened to by their male superiors or not taken seriously by their male peers. Always listen to the cat lady is what this film tells us. But yeah, I think like you could spend hours and hours and hours talking purely about what happens in this film, about like the narrative and the kind of creeping tension and dread, and how this film does something, absolutely new in terms of sci-fi cinema. So it comes out, 2 years after Star Wars, which is, essentially a Western in space, right? It's this grand swashbuckling space opera. And then it comes a few years before things like Blade Runner, also directed by Ridley Scott, E.T., The Thing, things like this, but it's something so new. What we have had in science fiction cinema and TV up to this point has been this very glossy, almost like Apple Genius Bar version, very middle class version of space. So yeah, to have essentially this like blue collar workplace drama on screen to emphasize that, yes, like the working classes don't go away simply because it's the future. That's not true. That's not truly like a progressive notion in the way that that Star Trek would have it be. Like just simply removing currency doesn't take away kind of the existence of social classes. And the way like this film just absolutely, is so smart about the ways that this crew, I mean, you do have like distinctions between, for lack of a better term, like the non-enlisted and enlisted members. I mean, I know it's not the military, but, folks like Dallas and Ripley herself versus folks like Parker and Brett, played by Yaphet Kotto and Harry Dean Stanton. So none of them are aristocrats by any stretch of the imagination, not even the senior officers. But nevertheless, we can recognize like the different factions on this crew, even though it is, essentially like a factory or a warehouse or like a truck in space,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the film takes great pains to establish in the first, scene with dialogue that Harry Dean Stanton's character and Yaphet Kotto's characters, they are very concerned. Like, we understand that they are on the lower rung, that they are probably going to get less, their labor is less valued than everyone else's labor on the ship, even though they are the ones who, it seems to me, do the maintenance work that really keeps the ship, functioning. Right.
Right.
And then that is absolutely the kind of ecosystem of capitalism in which certain labor, no matter how essential or difficult or whatever it might be, is like is undervalued. It's underpaid relative to other. I mean, everyone is essentially, I'm sure, underpaid, but even within that, there's a competitive hierarchy that kind of pits workers against other workers, rather than being unified against, the system itself, or the higher ups, the executives and the people who are really raking in the money and profiting off of the exploitation of everyone else's labor.
Yeah, and the film is very careful to emphasize, both by the way that we see Ash, the science officer played by Ian Holm, who we, spoiler alert, 40-year-old spoiler alert, turns out to be an android. But he is often set off by himself in shots, whereas normally the crew, we will have people either in larger groups where it's the entire cast together, or smaller, subgroups. But Ash is normally by himself, and this is completely appropriate as we find out that he is in fact the clear sort of representation of management of the company itself, and so he represents and will, enact and try and execute those priorities of capital. There's this, kind of, the lie is given that this is about like scientific, the increase of scientific knowledge, but it really is about militarism. It's about money, and Ash is kind of the avatar for those demands. I think, like, again, going back to the way the ship looks, this is when I say that, like, I wish I could have seen this in 1979, because, if you had grown up on a diet of, Star Trek or, the Forbidden Planet or whatever, just seeing this kind of like grimy, rusty, lived in space. And there's something so fantastic being done with sound in this film, and the way that the sound design emphasizes the fact that this is a working ship. So you will hear chains rustling. You will hear like metal kind of creaking and expanding. You will hear like the intake and outtake of oxygen vent systems. And so at the same time that this ship represents kind of the wholly mechanical, nevertheless, by this like constant kind of like carpeting of literal sound, like diegetic sound in it, there's this weird kind of life to the ship, even when there's no people in the shot. So like that fantastic kind of opening tracking shot of this empty ship, we don't yet see the crew. They're still in a hypersleep, but you see these kind of markers of life, this incredibly, we assume, like the technological achievement to get this, building into space
Right.
is kind of belied by, like, what do they call it? Like those perpetual motion duck machines.
Yeah.
Kind of moving on a table, and then, like, a coffee pot off to the side. And then, like, there's this scene where like this gentle breeze is like rifling papers. Where's that breeze coming from?
Right. Yeah. Though you mentioned coffee pots, I have to say also, like, I love how much coffee drinking and cigarette smoking is in this film. Like,
listen, this is a movie of the 70s. The idea that people wouldn't smoke, or that you wouldn't be able to smoke absolutely everywhere.
Right.
Just no one can conceive of it.
And speaking of it being a film of the 70s, the other, like, the connection that my mind kept making as I was watching it was to Jaws, the film Jaws, which had come out like in 1975, I think, or about a few years prior to this. In the sense that in both, I think the original idea in Jaws was to show the shark more, but they understood that it just didn't look that great, and that it was more terrifying ultimately to not show the shark very much, and just for audiences to have that idea of the shark, like it's to feel its presence rather than to see it. And of course, when you do see the shark, what you basically see is that maw, the leaping out of the water. And similarly in Alien, I mean, if the xenomorph were to, like, be clearly seen, it would probably kind of just look like a goofy, a guy in a goofy suit, right? So you rarely, you see the xenomorph, the alien, only kind of shrouded in shadow, only glimpsed, and you get those intense close-ups of the mouth within the mouth, the jaws within the jaws. So in both cases, like, these almost unseen, or only very rarely seen, like unstoppable killing machines that are represented when you do see them, largely by their mouths. Just a weird kind of comparison there that that my mind made, and I think, and to me, like, that is also something that is maybe lost, or not completely lost, but certainly something that I find more, typically, broadly speaking, more effective and interesting as a sort of suspense / horror technique is the fear of the unseen presence that is there, but rather than, I think there's a lot of pressure these days to put stuff on screen, right? To visualize, to show, to put money into effects and things, and to me, still, it's often remains more terrifying to not see the danger.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, the transition from Alien, 1979, to Aliens, its immediate sequel in, I think, 1986, from sci-fi horror, workplace drama, to action film, sort of emphasizes this, right? Because we do see more of the alien, the xenomorph, in Aliens, which is something that action films demand. Like, you need to be able to sort of clearly delineate, or more clearly delineate, the antagonist, such that when the antagonist is dispatched, we find it more believable. We have more sort of investment in the kind of pitched battle between the protagonist and the antagonist. Horror doesn't offer that kind of, that clarity, because it really is about the fear of the unknown when it's at its most effective. I want to talk a little bit about H.R. Giger, the Swiss, I think, artist whose visual style, whose work constructing the insides of the alien ship they first see when they crash down, or when they head down to LV-426. So much of the look of this film comes from Dan O'Bannon, the writer, and Ridley Scott, the director, kind of working in tandem with Giger. And I want to go back to something you said, Carol, about, like, the meshing of, like, the biological and the mechanical and the, like, sexual, and just there's so much going on there, and it is unsettling in a really a way that I want to unpack. because I'm not sure what's at the root of it. And yet it seems to be, and I recognize this is a dangerous term to use, but it feels like such a universal kind of fear, right? Like the conflation or the enmeshing of things that we typically assume are very distinct. So the kind of living organism of a ship, we don't understand that and we don't like it. A creature like the xenomorph, which seems to be almost like half metal and has, acid for blood, and whose gender is indeterminate for us, and who makes perhaps, our gender indeterminate. Like that's a huge part of what's going on in this film, right? Like I don't want to, reduce things to a binary here, but I clearly, there's a lot going on in the film about the horrors of like male penetration or male pregnancy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the chest burster scene, obviously it suggests a kind of birth. Is it Ash who at one point refers to the creature that escapes as Cain's son?
Yeah,
so there's the film makes that explicit, like this idea that Cain has kind of given birth to this thing. So it's definitely playing off of our kind of whatever primal, kind of fears and discomforts and squeamish feelings and everything we have around, all of that, like transgressive stuff in that space.
Just the ways in which things aren't clearly one thing or another. That's the site of so much horror. But if we travel down the road, speaking specifically about like the slippage that the film posits between like gender and talk sort of more in general about gender in the film, man, this is so clearly a movie of the 70s, right? Like both in its sort of, naturalism, but also in the way that like sort of casual, this is such a small moment and yet it lands with such a thud now, like casual moments of sexual harassment. So there's the scene when they're sitting around the table with, this is after Cain has the chest burster, or excuse me, before the chest burster bursts out of his chest, so the face hugger has disappeared.
The happy, yay, Cain's okay.
It's almost like it's a family meal.
Let's have one last meal before we go back into hyper sleep and head home.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so they're complaining about the food, and Parker says to Lambert, like, well, I'd rather be eating something else.
And it's just, the fact that there are comparatively few moments like this in the film. And I do think it's important that line is given to the one black member of the crew, but also one of the more like blue collar members of the crew. We cannot imagine Dallas, for instance, behaving this way. But the fact that there are so few of them makes them that much more stark. It also means that Lambert's role in the film, as a whole, doesn't rest entirely as easy with me as other folks in it, because in many ways, she is the kind of figure that most marks this as a horror film, because the role she plays is primarily to be the kind of screaming girl in the film. Right?
Yes.
That's really all she offers. We know that she's a science officer. She's incredibly intelligent. There's a conversation she has with Dallas where she's talking about the calculations she's done. So clearly she has earned her place in this crew. But in terms of like her role in the film, she is a drag. She freezes in the sight of horror. She is there to be a contrast in many ways to Ripley, who is the antithesis of this. And I think this is so interesting because so much is made of the fact that Ripley, as originally written, was not a woman.
So what I always heard was, and I haven't seen the documentary Memory. I don't know if they talk about this in Memory, but is that in the original screenplay, none of the characters' genders were specified. So
we see in that documentary a script note that says the crew is does it say unisex? But essentially saying they're interchangeable. So they can be of any gender. Of course, they say men or women, but
right.
But my point is that at some point, once the determinations were made that Lambert was going to be played by a female actor and Ripley was going to be played by a female actor, certain choices were made that I am assuming would not have been made had those characters been played by men. There would not have been a line from Parker to Lambert saying, like, I'd like to be eating something else. Yeah.
Probably. I mean, not it, or it would have been
that we assume it's directed at Lambert.
Of male camaraderie, like, hey, buddy, can't wait to get back to where there's some women, as opposed to having that undercurrent of like the wink and the nudge and the sexual, like, come on, the overtone of the sexual, come on. It would have just been. It would have played completely differently.
Well, exactly. And then another thing that would have played and been shot, and I absolutely assume, dressed completely differently, is that famous scene of Ripley in her underwear after she thinks that, now that the ship she has successfully caused it to self-destruct, she is safe. She and Jonesy are safely on the shuttle, heading for rescue. She strips down to a tank top and underwear that barely covers her ass. And again, this is something that, once gender determinations are made, then a whole house of cards of other determinations, or dominoes rather, sort of fall into place. One of the reasons why Ripley is shot in that fashion is to emphasize her vulnerability, right? And the complete shock of thinking she has dispatched this monster, and she truly has nothing. Like, she is down to her skin. When men are in that position, that moment is not sexualized in the same way that Ripley is.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's no question about that. That's definitely a critique of the film and of the way that women are framed, in cinema, just across the board throughout so much of cinema history. I mean, I do, watching this film again, I mean, I'm always struck by Sigourney Weaver in this role, because I feel like she is strikingly beautiful, but I feel like she has a kind of beauty that is not like the standard Hollywood female beauty. There's something stronger about her features, for instance. She's
what people used to call a handsome woman.
Yeah, exactly. Or, I'm sure a lot of, queer women like me, find her very attractive in this film. It's interesting, like, even her sexuality, like, she's not I'm sure a lot of men found her attractive, but also like a lot of men probably didn't find her attractive, So I don't know. I just find it.
I think you're right. Like, it's not a given that she's like an object of desire, and that's certainly not hinted at all during the rest of the film, which is so welcome, and so revelatory in so many ways. Like, it's amazing to think sometimes that, like, this did come out in 1979. And so, you have these kind of fucked up moments, with like the gender dynamics on the crew. But the fact that you have so few of them is amazing. So we never get, moments of like Parker and Lambert, because it's always given to like that class of people or the non-white characters to express kind of like gross sexualized humor and stuff like this. Typically, we never get those moments of them talking about like Ripley's body, which we would typically expect. And, I was watching this film earlier, and again, being my typical asshole self, but I was like, man, in the 70s, you could get away with having a film with almost all ugly people. Now, Tom Skerritt is not ugly. None of these people are ugly. They're not hideous by any means. Sigourney Weaver is actually gorgeous, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Like, not the typical kind of like, Hollywood version of a scientist. There's no way we would have this many of them, in a film.
Yeah. So I haven't seen the Ridley Scott's latter Alien films, but you're right. Like, look at the cast of those films. You've got Charlize Theron, Idris Elba. I mean,
Noomi Rapace. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, they're maybe not everyone in them is, is like a knockout, but they're definitely stacked with like people who are considered very attractive. Whereas that's part of, again, what's so refreshing about the look of this film is that, I mean, it's somehow it makes it more believable, everything about this whole scenario, that the cast rather doesn't have like, they don't all look like movie stars,
Yeah.
I mean, because I love the kind of explicit capitalist critique in this film, it reminded me though that, it's kind of interesting how artists can create things that have very explicit themes, but those artists don't necessarily like abide by or live by those themes themselves, or even really care about them very much. Because I don't know, it just reminded me that so there's a book called Future Noir: The Making of Blade Runner, which I read many years ago. I mean, I read it in college, so we're talking ancient history, but a very in-depth kind of fascinating look at the making of Blade Runner. And one of the things I recall very vividly from reading that book is about a labor dispute that happened on the set of Blade Runner, because Blade Runner was made in Los Angeles. Whereas Alien, and Scott was used to working in the UK, right?
Right.
And on the set of Blade Runner, the tech crew and people were unionized, which I think was not the case in his previous work. And in some like interview, a TV or magazine interview, or an interview of some kind, like Ridley Scott expressed, he kind of complained a bit about the attitudes of the tech people on Blade Runner. He said, like, he said something like, where I come from, or, in my previous work, like, the crew typically responds to your requests or your demands with "Yes, Governor." And
what the fuck?
And so what the crew folks on Blade Runner did after that was they had T-shirts made that said "Yes, Governor, my ass," and they wore those. They wore those like as they're working on set. So there are photos, Blade Runner production set, behind the scenes photos where you can see tech, crew members wearing T-shirts that say "Yes, Governor, my ass." So anyway,
yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, so we'll come back to this because it's actually my freak out for the week, but there is a new documentary called Memory: The Origins of Alien that is kind of a look back at the beginnings of this film. And it's quite, most of it is about kind of the genesis of the project in Dan O'Bannon's mind and the way it eventually transitioned into what we saw on screen. But then also, just these great, like, film scholars and media critics and, independent pop culture nerds talking about the film. Near the beginning of the documentary, someone talks about how Dan O'Bannon had gone off to the UK, I think, to Paris to work with Jodorowsky on the infamously ill-fated Dune adaptation that never made it to screen. Came back, had no money, and was just kind of couch surfing. And then, while couch surfing and working on the project that was originally called Star Beast that became Alien, invented this game that was called Poverty, that was a takeoff of Monopoly. And so I love this idea that, that Dan O'Bannon, the kind of, class critiques that are inherent in this film are deliberate. And so the fact that like Ridley Scott,
yeah,
sort of didn't, demonstrate that, whatever. But I will say, like, the way this project came together, this film has been written about and talked about just an incredible amount. So you can find just tons of great, criticism and, background stuff. If you're at all interested in the film, I highly encourage it because it's just fascinating. So yeah, the the fact that Dan O'Bannon, worked with Jodorowsky on, this Dune project that never got off the ground. The fact that Dan O'Bannon apparently had Crohn's disease and was subject to such intense intestinal pains that partially led to his creation of the chest burster monster. This shit is fascinating. What?
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite films, and it's like a perfect little nugget of a thing, and it led to so much. The kind of gritty version of this gritty sci-fi universes that we largely demand these days from our media can absolutely be traced back to things like Alien and to, Ridley Scott's kind of visual style that he put on screen. Because, before this, I think the closest you would have seen to something like this would have been like a submarine movie, these kind of like enclosed, mechanical, claustrophobic, sweaty spaces, but we would not have seen this in space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a completely revolutionary, vision of space, as you say. So rewatching the film, though, another thing that struck me. Have you seen the latter Alien films? Have you seen Prometheus or Covenant?
Unfortunately, I have seen Prometheus and Alien Covenant. And that's the other thing about watching this film now, right? Is that, I have not seen the Alien versus Predator movies. I think I've seen maybe one. But there's definitely slippage in my mind between things that happen in the first, like the original film of the franchise, and things that we come to know later about like the xenomorph, and everything. And so I wish I could just go back to that originary moment where I didn't know what was going to happen. And like the cast of Alien, like Tom Skerritt and Veronica Cartwright, I'm simply in that room watching, John Hurt lie out on a table and then seeing this chest burster come out and having my mind fucking blown.
Yeah, because watching this film, it's not like I feel some need coming away from this film to I really want everything explained to me, right? I feel like it works very well, not having it explained what the ship or the being in the chair on the planet's surface is, what any of it is.
Right.
And also a lot of people in my limited experience, because I haven't seen the films, but a lot of people seem to criticize those films, Prometheus and or Covenant. I don't remember which one or both, but for being maybe particularly egregious in terms of the crew just making boneheaded decisions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But watching this film, I'm like, Kane, when he's on the planet's surface and it's like, and the egg opens up and he's just leans into it. And I'm like, come on, dude, don't do that. I feel like there's almost in horror, there's almost a requirement for that, the element of the human fuck up that sets everything in motion and that endangers everyone else. Right. And it's what Ripley, tries to cut off, by refusing to open the door when they're trying to bring Kane in, and Ash just overrides her, and of course because he has his own orders from on high. But yeah, sometimes people do really stupid shit, and that's part of, to me, that's almost like an element of horror is the things we do that inadvertently put us and or others in danger.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I do think though the difference is that in this film, the boneheaded decisions that are made at least have, if not a logical background, they at least make some sort of sense, whether that's, crew members caring for a fellow crew member and wanting to help him, or, their work being like sabotaged, subverted, in secret by a character like Ash or whatever. Like everything that ultimately comes from the hubris of, like Dallas, for instance, as captain, ultimately can be explained in a way that it can't in like Alien Covenant, for instance.
Okay.
Like the film just asks us to swallow a lot of boneheaded decisions that don't even make sense in the moment, but are absolutely vital for the film to progress.
Okay.
And so it's just kind of unsettling. But, speaking of like, the mistakes that have to happen or the arrogance that a character has to demonstrate for like the engine of a horror movie to function. Yeah, I have to admit that I love that if folks had listened to Ripley from the beginning, none of this would have happened. But also, if folks had listened to Parker, it's so great when the Black person who is not going to make it to the end of a horror movie tells people like, y'all need to quit fucking with this. He tells them like, we need to put this in storage, like, and freeze it. If they had just listened, none of this shit would have happened. Parker, I'm going to dress like you for Halloween. No one's going to get it but Carolyn, but I feel like true fans deserve to, demonstrate their love for you. Can't get over it. Anyways, I encourage everyone to watch Alien in its 40th anniversary year. This film is middle-aged, y'all. Check it out. It is contrary to what you may hear or may read in Amazon comment threads. The film is incredibly non-dated. It is still so impactful. Actually, before we wrap up, I do want to say about the visual style of the film not looking dated. So yeah, it comes out in 1979. The technology, like the way that computers look or the way that, screens show information doesn't look the way that they look even now, let alone what we assume they would look like hundreds of years in the future. But part of what I love about it is that I can absolutely buy that this commercial towing vehicle, which is like a warehouse in space, would have like beat down equipment.
Oh, absolutely. Just toss
like you're not putting the Rolls Royce into space, like you're putting the 18-wheeler. Like this job is out there to perform a function, and it's gonna get grimy, it's gonna get dirty, and so yeah, the fact that it's strictly utilitarian actually works better for me than if it were too glossy.
Same, 100%. I love the computer readouts and stuff in this film so much.
I also love how this film does fall into that trap of assuming that our communication and exchanges with computers in the future will be idiomatic. So, gosh, Dallas doesn't say like he's having a conversation with Mother, the ship, which is named, or the computer, which is named Mother, and he doesn't say what's up, but he says something like God, what is he? It's something where I'm just like, that's absolutely not something that a computer could parse, Like you're not having a conversation. That's not how you get information. Whatever.
Right.
Go watch the film. You will love it. And if you don't love it, I would like to hear about it in my DMs because you're frankly wrong. And I want to convince you of it. Caro.
Yo.
Let's give the people a little bit of break and then come back for What's Your Freak Out?
Let's do it. Hey, Feminist Frequency Radio listeners, why not join our Patreon community at patreon.com/femfreak? Seriously, what are you waiting for?
What's your freak out?
All right, now it is time to talk about what's been thrilling us, moving us, upsetting us, or infuriating us this past week, month, year, whatever. Caro, give it to me. What's going on in your brain?
I'm going to freak out about a new album by an artist who I've been following and admiring for over 20 years now. A dude named Joseph Arthur, who he has like one song called In the Sun that most people, if they hear it, or a lot of people, they hear it, they know it. It's been, performed by like Michael Stipe and by the Coldplay guy. Like this one song that just got like huge recognition. But But, Joseph Arthur has like been consistently putting out really adventurous, great, just excellent albums, for the past 20 plus years, not getting a whole lot of, I mean, he's very well respected by a certain core, group, but not getting much recognition or success beyond that. But, I'm one of those longtime loyal fans, and he has a new album. His new album is called Comeback World, and it is a kind of, it's in a lot of ways, it's a more optimistic record than a lot of his other albums. You could even, I could even see some people calling it maybe, especially if they didn't know his body of work. I could see some people listening to it and calling it a little preachy, or maybe at times sounding a little like naive. But the thing is that if you've been on that musical journey with him, like I have and like other fans have, like, that he has probed the darkness, and that he's been in the shit, and that there's something to me kind of, I mean, he's earned, in my view, he's earned the right to like whatever hard fought like hope and optimism you can really hear in the new record. And to me that makes it more, it doesn't have any kind of like it doesn't have a kind of naivete to it with which I might dismiss it. Otherwise, if I didn't know, if I weren't more familiar with his work, it's more like, this is a place he's arrived at after going through all of this. And so for me, there's something really hopeful about it. It's renewing. It's just a really, in my view, a great record, and just the latest strong album from an artist who I think's been doing really outstanding work for a very long time. So, if you're looking for some new music, if you like singer-songwriters, maybe give Joseph Arthur a listen.
Awesome. I am really into finding, new music these days. Like, for the most part, the music I listen to, like the TV I watch, like the movies I watch, the books I read, it's all retreads. Like, I just don't have the mental fortitude to consume a lot of new stuff these days. I need to know what's coming. But I'm slowly coming out of that, and I'm really digging a lot of the new shit that I've been hearing. So I'm going to check out Joseph Arthur. I'm into it.
Yeah, nice.
My freak out for the week is the documentary I mentioned. I have two freak outs, actually.
All right.
Documentary I mentioned earlier, which is Memory, The Origin of Alien. It's directed by the guy who did The People versus George Lucas, I think. But it's just got this great... So of the cast, they get Tom Skerritt and Veronica Cartwright. But it's mostly people who worked with Ridley Scott, Dan O'Bannon's wife, Diane O'Bannon, talking about, like, as I say, the genesis of the movie, and really getting into some interesting stuff about the filmmaking, which was just fascinating to me. So you have one of the people talking about like the use of like wide angle lenses to lend that sense of claustrophobia as we're going through the corridors of the Nostromo, versus like the anamorphic lenses, which Ridley Scott used to have sort of constant movement on the screen. I love stuff like this because there's so much, even though I've seen this film a million times, there were so many things that I had not picked up on. And this is not to say that you need to subscribe to any of the, sort of analyses put forth by any of the people in the film, but there are interesting, provocative questions that are posed, and there are really thoughtful responses and takes on the film that I think, if you're interested in the film, the franchise, Ridley Scott as a director, whatever, it's just a pretty interesting documentary. There was one shot breakdown in particular that I found super fascinating, and it was about the class politics that Carol and I have been talking about. They were talking about the scene wherein Ripley, Brett, Parker, and Dallas are seated in this kind of alcove area, and Ripley is ragging on Brett for always saying right whenever Parker says something. So when Parker says, we just need to freeze this alien, like, we can't do anything for Kane. Let's freeze him, get him to a doctor, whatever. Brett says, right, he always does this. Ripley's ragging on him for it. So the person talking about this scene, breaks down how the shot is composed such that Dallas, you can see the moment where Dallas starts to feel uncomfortable with the way that his authority is being challenged in the moment. And he is bracketed by Brett on one side and Parker on the other. And he makes a very deliberate choice to leave that framing and head to the back of the shot where Ripley and Lambert are, who represent people of his own class. But also I think it's important that both women are representatives of the supervisory / management class, right? Like he allies himself with them against the what we know to be better ideas of the blue collar members of his crew. It was just a fascinating moment, and I had never thought about the way that shot was created and composed and who sat where. But it's a wonderful reminder that sometimes the smallest things on screen have been planned out for very careful reasons. And I just absolutely love that. As a film fan, I just absolutely love that. So check out Memory, the Origin of Alien. Also, I did not realize this, but a friend of mine is in it. I'm not going to tell you which person I know in the film, but I'm going to try and maybe surprise you with a bonus if I can get him on the phone. So anyway.
Awesome.
So that's my freak out for the week. You can submit your own freak out at feministfrequency.com/freakout. And FYI, we haven't been getting a lot of submissions lately. What's up? I know y'all are out there freaking out. You're freaking out in my Twitter DMs. Freak out on, a voicemail and send it to us.
Do it.
Do it. Thank you so much for listening to Feminist Frequency Radio. Stay tuned for the freaking after party, which is only available to backers of this podcast. You want to be one. Now is the time. You can learn more at patreon.com/femfreak. You can find us anywhere great podcasts are found. If you haven't, go to iTunes and subscribe, rate and review us. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and all the social medias at FemFreak. The show is engineered by Rob Pera. Sarah Norales provides technical support. Artwork is by Jamie Varon, and our intro music is by Phil Circus and Marty the Dog. Join us next week for another feminist dive into pop culture. Thanks for listening.
Later.
Bye.